Paul, thank you so much for coming back on L&D Disrupt. It's great to have you on the show again.
It's really good to be here again. Yeah.
I think if people have listened from the start, they will know your name because you were the first guest we ever actually had on the show. And then we had you back about sort of 25 episodes in, and you were the first guest actually when I started hosting it with Nelson. And now, so we've got you back again for the third time. Probably this is going to be coming out around January, and again, helping people get ahead of the big year ahead and making sure they're driving impact. So, but before we get into all of that, I'd love people to know a little bit about who you are if they're not familiar and what it is you do.
It's always an awkward question. Who am I? That's an existential question if you think about it. I suppose what gives me some credibility to spout about this stuff is I've written 3 books in the L&D world. All did fairly well, and some are in reprint, and I've written numerous articles. I speak at conferences all over the world on this kind of stuff. And alongside that, I've got a company which has developed some really specialist niche learning software in the behavioral change and learning workflow area. So so there's all of those things, but I've been in and about the L&D world now for decades, and I come at it from an engineering mindset because that's my background, is mechanical engineering. So it gives me a slightly different perspective on it, and I kind of bring that engineering, what works, to it. And you might notice the accent, I'm a Kiwi, so I also bring that kind of Kiwi can-do, farm boy, just get a simple solution and get it working type thing. And I find that's really helpful, really useful. So
yeah, I agree. A lot of the great people I've spoken to in this space are from traditionally a different industry or a different sector, and they come with that mindset of let's implement the stuff I've seen work elsewhere to the learning and development space, and it's a nice mindset to have.
Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to get you back on today, Paul, is you recently posted a great article on the importance of getting the basics right before we embrace new technology. And we'll be putting this out around the start of January, when a lot of people will have their strategy in their mind. They might be considering new tech for the year ahead. So that's kind of what we're going to discuss today. The sort of fundamentals of getting things right before the new year, not getting too sucked in by shiny new things, and making sure we're doing all the basics we need to have a great 2024. So on that note, I mean, what are some of the fundamentals that people should be getting in place as we enter the new year? And if they've got aspirations to drive impact, what are some of the basics we can reset to and make sure we're doing those right?
So within the question you just asked, the primary phrase that stands out to me is the driving impact phrase. Driving impact is, it begs the question, what is impact? I mean, we often talk about it, but what do we mean by it? So for me, impact in an organization is change that has an effect on that organization. And clearly we want a positive impact rather than a negative one, because it can go both ways. So for each initiative or whatever you're thinking to do during 2024, or even for your whole entire L&D strategy, you need to be defining what you mean by impact. Because until you can define that, and then you don't really know where you're going. And then the second thing is you need to state how you will know it has happened. So how will you know that impact has actually occurred? And particularly the impact that you want. How will you know that that has occurred? And then you've got, okay, this is a kind of goal, if you like, is this impact on the organization. And this is how we'll know it's happening or has happened, or that we're halfway to get there. So what sort of, in effect, measurement criteria will you use? How will you know? What will you see, hear, or feel that'll tell you that impact is starting to occur and then has occurred? And then you need to get agreement from the various stakeholders on those two things. And this is your fundamental, is what is the impact and how do we know it's happened?
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, because a lot of people start shooting from the hip saying, we'll get this bit of software, or we'll get this bit of technology, or we'll spend this money, we'll put this program in. Some senior person read something in an in-flight magazine and they think, oh, that's great, let's go and do some of that. Those in-flight magazines have a lot to answer for, I tell you. So that's a fundamental, is getting clarity on what impact means in your context, and then how to measure it, I guess, which is pretty obvious.
Yeah, no, it is when you say it like that. And I think impact will often lean towards numbers, and we might discuss that a bit. But I really like this idea of what you said about what do you see, hear, and feel, because that is a great way to establish what impact looks like. When X, Y, or Z is happening, what are the changes we're expecting to see in the ways people do their job or in the culture in our company? So, yeah, I love that idea. Any more thoughts on that? Like, what are the telling indicators that people could commonly look for as they take a more rounded view of what they're looking at, seeing, and hearing and feeling as they drive
Well,
change?
yeah, it's it's got to be sensory in the fact you've got to be able to observe it or notice it.
Yeah.
And so it might still be numbers, but what numbers will you see? And what behaviors will you see? What sort of conversations will you hear if the
Mm.
culture changes in the way that we want, if that's one of the impacts you're seeking? How will I feel when I walk around the offices or walk around the factory floor? How do other people say they are feeling as a result of the changes? So, it is got to be, you've got to observe something through your senses. So the question is, what are you going to observe or notice? And I think it's really important to get the distinction between, well, there's a set of numbers, but actually, um, how do people feel about all of that? Because a lot of business impact that's required is cultural often, and
Yeah.
that isn't necessarily just wrapped up in numbers.
Yeah.
Um,
No, exactly. I think something someone mentioned to me before that stuck with me is it's not often or not always about the destination, as in what numbers do we arrive at, but it's also about the journey there. So if a team might hit its goals, but we're not paying attention to things we see, feel, and hear, everybody could be burnt out by the time we reach the goal. Or, you know, relationships could have been damaged, or the overall culture could have suffered because we've all worked so hard to get to that short term goal. So I do really like this more rounded view of impact because it brings in the human element. We just tell a better story as well, I guess.
I think the other thing to remember too is that if a manager comes and says, "I want this learning initiative, I want this training, I want this," um, or there's an initiative you're doing proactively, ultimately there's going to be some stakeholders involved, and they will have a way of deciding whether what you've done is successful or not. They will be observing things, they will notice things that they then put against some internal yardsticks they've got about whether what you've done is successful. So you really have to talk to the stakeholders to say, if success occurs, from your perspective, how will you know? And then talk to another stakeholder and you'll get a different set of criteria. So if you've got multiple stakeholders, it's almost certain they're using multiple different sets of criteria to arrive at a conclusion as to whether the initiative you have delivered has been successful or not. And it really behooves you to go and check what those criteria are they're going to use, because that's what they're going to use. It doesn't matter how many measures you have as an L&D person. Ultimately, the people who will decide whether your initiative was successful or not are those who are the recipients and stakeholders in it. And you need to be thinking, well, how are they defining success and how are they measuring success? And if you think they don't have a measure, you're wrong, because they always will. Because the only reason they're going to come and ask for a program in the first place is if they have some sense that things aren't happening as well as they could be. So how do they get that sense of current underperformance? They're using a set of measures, whether they can define those consciously or not. So you need to be able to talk to them and help them understand, how are you measuring sub-performance right now, and how will you measure adequate performance at a later date? So there's your measures that you need to have in place. You can have lots of other measures as well, of course, but ultimately those measures are going to be sensory in origin against a set of implicit yardsticks they've got within themselves.
Mm.
And of course, if you get lots of stakeholders with lots of different measures, then you're kind of shooting at a very moving target there. So you need to get agreement amongst the stakeholders and clarity on what the impact is that you want, and then how each of them, all of them, will agree, yes, here is how we're going to measure whether the impact's occurred. So to me, that's really fundamental. And you need that in place before you start thinking about technology or anything else, quite frankly. So it's right
Yeah.
bedrock fundamental.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, it was the next thing I wanted to ask you was, I think from the article and what you're saying, you're seeing this common problem that I am as well, that people are rushing to adopt and implement tech before they work out what the real problems are trying to solve or what impact really looks like. And I love this angle as well of doing that together. We can't define that in a silo, because if we do and then we take it to other people, we're going to get
Yeah.
pushback. So I really wanted to ask you about that problem diagnosis phase. What are some of the tips you give people for making sure they push back and get to the root cause of what problems need to be solved, and they involve the right people in that process?
Well, I wrote a book on that, strangely enough, but it's the one with the red cover if anybody's interested. But certainly going hell for leather in the wrong direction is a bit stupid when you think about it. And some companies do that. They will shoot for the hip, they'll go for it, and they'll make decisions and take actions which haven't really been, they're not supporting a cohesive and coherent strategy that's addressing the business problems as they exist. And of course, the phrase they use is, well, what we're doing is not aligned with business. But actually, there's much more than alignment going on here. You've actually got to get that real clarity on what the business or the organization is looking to achieve in terms of supporting, delivering on its executing its organizational strategy and delivering to the constituents, whether that's patients or customers or whoever, who need their services and goods. So I think it's that whole diagnostics process needs to be looked at in terms that other than learning. And I think that's one thing that a lot of learning professionals kind of get wrong, is they will go into this process of saying, we are going to align our learning and training with the company stuff. And then they'll go and talk to one of the managers out there in the organization saying, okay, what's your problem? And then what learning can we give you to help with that problem? So the problem with that approach is that they are presupposing a learning solution to whatever problem this
Mm.
person is going to get put in front of them. So I think it's really important that you differentiate between what I term performance consultancy, or is commonly termed that, and learning consultancy. So performance consultancy is really a diagnostics process. It's much more of a consultancy process where you talk to people and say, okay, there's a current problem. We've recognized there's something going on. If we don't deal with it now, it's going to cost us money, maybe a lot of money over the next 6 or 12 months. So we've got to deal with it. So what is this problem? And how do we get down to the root cause of that problem? And then what will success look like as and when we solve the problem? So we're back to that clarity of outcome again. So that's that process. But notice in what I've just said there's nothing there about providing a learning solution to it. And only when you've gone through that diagnostics process and you've realized actually one of the potential parts of a number of potential solutions is to provide some learning, then you can start getting into learning consultancy to decide how to do that learning.
Yeah.
But almost always there's going to be a whole raft of other things that need to be done in tandem or in parallel, or maybe even before you do some learning.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that you think about performance consultancy and disassociate it from the learning consultancy. Like, you've got to do them in that order: performance
Yeah.
consultancy first, and learning consultancy second.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's that idea of not trying to go in and solutionize something, but to go in and diagnose it. And like you said, treat them as
Yeah,
two separate exercises. Like, my first part of this is to help you define the problem, but it's not necessarily for me to prescribe a solution. So I do like that mindset, and I think that is something useful people can apply.
I think one of the things too, you talked about, well, how do we get in? Another way to look at the problems is if we assume there's a problem to solve and we are there to solve these problems on behalf of parts of the organization. What we need to do is to be able to go in there and understand the problem well enough to try a range of reasonable solutions rather
Yeah,
than unreasonable ones. So how do we get together with somebody in the organization to understand their problem better? And we often find it hard enough to understand our own problems, let alone one brought to us by someone else. So I think the key tool here is empathy. Now, you can never really truly walk in someone else's shoes, but you can try, and it's worth a try. So think of it this way. It's about joining them in their problem space for a while so you can really try it on for size.
Mm.
So have them describe the problem, what they see, how it makes them feel, what they hear, what thoughts go round and round in their head as they think about the problem, where they see the blockers. So be them as much as you can be for a while. In other words, be empathetic with where they're at. Stand in their shoes as far as you're able. And then you've got to say, okay, I've kind of got that. Now come back into your own shoes and reflect on that from your own perspective. Now notice that when you are truly in someone else's problem space, it can really seem intractable. There's all sorts of
Mm.
reasons why this can't work and that can't work and this is impossible and how can we ever solve this? See, a problem by definition has boundaries that restrict it into a certain area. And if you can't see past those boundaries, you can't see the non-problem area, which is the place where all the solutions are. And
Mm.
that's why people get stuck in their problems, is they're in this bounded problem space. But to understand it, you have to go into that problem space with them for a while. And then you need to jump back out again and look from the outside and say, oh, okay, now I kind of get it.
Yeah.
Um, and then you can use another perspective as well, which is kind of the fly on the wall one, where you're looking at them as a problem holder and then you as a potential, provider of some kind of solution, but you're looking at that from outside like a fly on the wall. So notice there's actually three different perceptual positions here. There's yourself, there's the other, and there's the fly on the wall position. Now, each of those will give you a different insight into the problem. And you
Mm.
need to go and use them all to get clarity and a holistic view of what's going on. So then you can start being, useful in terms of coming up with potential solutions to the problem.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's all about
Mm.
empathy.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I agree. I often think of it as we're often too close to our own problems and other people are often too far away. And I think the idea is that if I'm coming in to help you diagnose a problem, I'm trying to get closer to the problem and I'm trying to maybe make you be a bit more self-aware or take a step back. And personally, that's what's always helped me is to maybe for
yeah.
someone to bring me out of the problem a little bit to help define it. And
And
observation is a great point.
that's a good consultancy tool, is you join them in the problem for a while in the problem
Yeah,
space, and then you jump out, but drag them with you so they can
yeah,
see the problem from the outside.
mm,
So you
yeah,
take them up and join you as a second fly on the wall, effectively.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
very often people will, from that distance, look down and say, "Oh, look, yeah, no, shit, it's obvious. Like, this is what I
yeah,
should be doing."
yeah.
But it would never
Now I
occur to
see it.
them in that space because they're inside their problem thought pattern.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that actually, because I think if someone comes to you and says, I need this piece of content, if you can say to them, let me spend an hour or two with you on the problem you're like trying to solve or what problem you think it's going to solve, then let's take a step back and look at it together. I do think that's also quite a collaborative way. It's a good way to build relationships with people. And like you said, empathy is important. Building connections with people is important, especially if we need to prod and diagnose and push back a little bit. We want it to be in good faith and in a good setting. And I love that example you shared because it feels like it ticks all those boxes.
Mm.
I also wanted to ask you what you think some of the risks are with people rushing headfirst into adopting a piece of tech or solutionizing before diagnosing. I mean, I guess there's a few things that come to mind for me, like the damage of the reputation in the business, potentially wasted resources. But is there anything that comes to mind for you in terms of what happens when we steam headfirst without thinking about impact and the problems to solve?
In my view, it's just simple malpractice.
Yeah,
If you think it from a medical analogy, if you went to a doctor and they started prescribing you something without really talking to you about what pain or symptoms you were feeling, you'd consider that malpractice.
mm,
You know, so yeah, it's malpractice. It's that simple, and that's really bad in my view.
yeah,
So you do need to get together and go through and come up with a decent process to get to the point of making a decision about a spend in terms of money or resources. If you're not, as I said, it's malpractice, and I
yeah,
don't consider. So yeah, so all those risks you mentioned. Um,
yeah. They're just downstream of that, aren't they?
yeah, yeah,
If you
absolutely.
don't, yeah, you dive headfirst into it about solving a problem. If someone else then realizes you're not helping them solve a problem, they might be less likely to come to you in the future. You don't have any tangible proof that what you did was worth the time or effort it spent. You might get yourself tied into using a tool without realizing what problem it might help you solve, and you're tied in for a time period. So yeah, I think there's so many pitfalls and risks with not spending that time up front defining the problems, or working out exactly what impact means to you. So yeah, I really like that.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned there is kind of, it comes back to the brand of L&D, which in many organisations is not that great. But of course, the more failures that L&D is seen to have or perceived to have, whether they were failures or not, it's the perception that counts. The more likely L&D is going to be sort of consigned to a container at the edge of the car park, and sort of they're just there for compliance stuff now, and we'll forget about them for everything else. So you get consigned to this L&D desert almost,
Yeah,
and once you're there, of course, your credibility is in the gutter, and you can't. That's really bad, because it's very difficult to start making any impact without that credibility to help you.
yeah.
So, yeah.
I suppose as well, considering when we're putting this out, which is the start of the year, something I've found useful typically from a marketing perspective at the start of the year is just to send out a survey to people and get an understanding of, what do you think we do well right now? What don't you think we do right now? What do you think we should do more of as a marketing team? What would you like to see more of? Any ideas, any feedback? Like a general 5 to 6 question thing. For L&D people trying to understand their current brand, do you think that's also a useful exercise to start the year off by just gauging where you are on that perception scale? And, if you are trying to turn the tide against a negative perception, or if you're already, the ball's rolling where people view you as a useful function?
Um, Sort of no harm done, but you've got to remember, if you do a survey and get some results, you've got to do something with them, putting them on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
shelf, or reading them and thinking, well, that's interesting, and then making no change
yeah,
will just mean that people then actually think even worse of you, because you've done a survey and done nothing about it. So yes, what are you going to stop? What are you going to start? What are you going to continue? What are you going to accelerate? In
mm,
terms of what you do, no
yeah,
harm done there. Um, but the way you actually can judge your brand as an L&D function is what people come and ask you for. If they think you sell blue widgets, they're going to come and ask you for blue widgets. They'll
mm,
never ask you for a red one. So what they come and ask you for is what they think you do. Now, if there's a whole bunch of things in L&D that you'd like to do and could do and would love to do for them, but you never get asked for, then that's a branding problem. And you need to get out and tell the world,
mm,
we can help you with this too. So there's a whole bunch of stuff
yeah,
on L&D brand that I think is really important. But it's probably out of the scope of
interesting.
this
Yeah,
webinar. Maybe another one in the future, we can do an L&D
yeah,
brand webinar.
yeah. No, I like that. I think it's also partly clarity, isn't it? It's not just how you perceive, but what do people think you do? Like you said, not just what you're known for, but what do people expect from you? So, like you say, if people
Yeah.
only think they come to you to grant requests for training, then that's all they'll do. But if you're creating clarity around, look, this is what I can help you do. These are the things I'm here to help you do. I can help your department improve X. I can help Y. I think it just comes back to that problem discovery, actually. If I'm going to people and diagnosing the problem, I can pitch how I'm part of solving it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, performance
And
consultancy is one of the fastest ways to start fixing a brand problem in L&D.
yeah,
But as I said, that's a
yeah,
bigger, longer conversation in terms
yeah,
of.
100%. Yeah. I also like the framing you mentioned, like stop, start, continue. Maybe my exercise of asking other people is better served as an exercise of self-reflection for people, and potentially an L&D or people role. But, at the start of the year, looking self-reflectively on what is it that I do well, what is it I have impact by doing, what should I stop doing, what should I continue or evolve to do, because I think that personally I've found that to be a useful exercise in terms of saying, for example, we used to do a newsletter in a much different form, and we found it just wasn't growing our audience quick enough. The time it took wasn't worth the value we were getting. So although we'd invested time in it, really it was a thing we should stop so we could start doing other things or invest more time in something else. So I wonder if a self-reflective exercise is also useful for the start of the year before they get into this problem discovery.
I think part of that too should be, what's the value proposition of L&D within the organisation. That's a bigger discussion again, but
Mm,
L&D has to provide and be perceived to provide value. And there are some neat little exercises you can do around the value proposition.
yeah.
But again, that's another webinar again.
Yeah, yeah, we can't get into that too much. Is there any general advice or like one tip you would give people for trying to work out that value prop or understanding it?
The value proposition is really often around, well, what pain are people experiencing to achieve the things they want to achieve in our target market? Because you can use pure marketing terms for this. And then how can I develop a pill, if you like, to handle that pain and wrap it up in a
Yeah,
way that's acceptable to the target market and deliver it to them at a cost that's actually acceptable too? So there's the value proposition is, but until you know enough about your target market and what they're doing, what they're seeking to achieve and the pain they're experiencing achieving that, then how can you help them with that? And that's how
yeah,
you start building a general value proposition. But
yeah.
yeah,
I think that's a nice flow into the next thing I wanted to ask you, because I forgot to mention that some of this comes from the article, which I'll add to the description. Some of this comes from your newsletter, which we can also add the sign up page for to the description. But a recent newsletter, you were talking about the importance of listening as part of that problem discovery process. I think particularly around being intentional and ensuring that you are listening to understand, not simply to reply. And I think often when we want to push back and diagnose, we can get into that habit of jumping in before we really hear someone out. So I just wanted to get your insights on the role of listening to understand as we diagnose problems as an L&D team.
I think we've sort of covered a bit of that in terms of joining someone in their problem space and really seeking to understand it. The only way you're going to do that is to listen to them and be with them and not just immediately start trying to figure out how to fix things, is just be
Mm,
with the problem without trying to fix it for a while, and really get to know what it feels like to be them inhabiting that problem.
yeah.
Um, and
And
you will
ditching
do that through
assumptions as well.
listening to them and what they've got to say. So it's listening without judgment. It's listening to just hear what's there. It's not listening in order to speak. It's not listening in order to give them a solution. It's not, none of that
Yeah,
stuff. Not yet, anyway. Eventually, of course, you will need to have that conversation around. But first, it's an information gathering exercise. Um, but it's not just information um, coloured, if you like, with the spectacles you would look through. It needs to be information that's coloured with the spectacles they look through. And that's why this empathy is so important. You need to stand in front of their problem and view it through their eyes as much as you can and see it through the filters they use as a manager out there in the business or as a team leader or whatever. Um, there's some real skills in that, and it takes some practice. And some people are really bad at listening. Um,
yeah,
just because you hear something doesn't mean you've listened to it, or vice versa. I can't, whichever way around. But you
yeah,
know what I mean. It's just
yeah,
because you've heard some words doesn't mean that you've understood and really grasped what it is that person is saying. So
yeah,
keep paraphrasing, keep talking, and trying to say, so if I understand you correctly, is this what you're saying? And then feed it back to them. And they'll tell you, well, no, 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 that's not what I mean. What I mean is just keep going round and round until you've got it. And
yeah,
then you've got a reasonable chance of coming up with a solution. So absolutely listening is critical to all of that. Um,
yeah. I like that point as well. Like, there's self-awareness that sometimes we are just bad listeners. I think we have to work on these skills as well. So the point you made there, clarification is a skill we should work on when we're having these conversations. Are we trying to improve our skill of saying, so what I'm hearing is this, this, and this? Is that correct? Are we building in that function? Are we working on ditching assumptions before we go into that conversation? Like, these are things we can work on over time. I think listening is something you need to work on, diagnosing problems or sort of comprehending them in real time and repeating it back. Those are things we can work on. So I guess that's a useful tip for people as well, is just to think about that intentionally.
I think it's also about prepping questions. If you know you're going into a meeting where you're going to have to listen and really understand at a deep level what someone else is experiencing, you've got to come up with some questions you can ask them, a list that you can go through to help you with that. And your purpose is not then to get through the questions, it's to use them as a way of prompting things. And you can come up with some good. So, for example, if you're talking to someone about their problem, you can ask, this is an interesting question. How would you know that your problem is 50% solved?
Mm,
Not 100% solved, but 50% solved.
mm,
That'll make them really start thinking about, well, how do I know I've even got a problem? And then How would I know it's 100% solved? Because then I've got to figure out, well, if it's only 50% solved, what would I notice then? And it starts to really tease out and give you a really granular view of what you're doing, but you've got to listen to hear what they say in response to that. So having
Yeah.
some useful
Yeah,
questions like that is a great way to go into those meetings to help you listen well.
we rarely have this situation where we go from 0 problem to 100 problems solved. I like this framing of what if it was 50% done, because there are milestones on the way to solving a problem that we can look out for. Coming back to the point at the start, what we see and hearing and feeling, we can maybe use questions like the one you just gave there to prompt people into that, because there'll be telltale signs we're getting closer to the problem, but it's very difficult to just view that one linear line from naught to problem solved.
It also gives you insight into the criteria they are using to decide the problem is solved. And, how would they know the problem is 50%? In other words, what would they observe if the problem is 50% solved? So what you're digging into is what are the internal yardsticks they are using implicitly to measure the existence of this problem, or non-existence of it, or half existence of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I really like that. And following on from another newsletter topic you recently shared, I think you were talking about the ability to drive behavior change in order for us to hit our goals and build the right skills. And you mentioned that a bit at the start as well. But I just wanted to see if you had any tips on what the basics of good behavior change, or a good approach to when we're trying to change behavior. What does that look like in practice?
Well, behavior change are us. So, it,
Yeah.
you started talking about impact. That's interesting, because if you think about it, impact generally only happens for a learning initiative when people do things differently or do different things. And that little definition, by the way, is what Robin Hoyle uses, the definition of learning: people doing different things or doing things differently.
Yeah.
So how does behavior change? It's a simple answer: in a series of steps over time. Very, very seldom you get sort of a blinding flash on the road to Damascus type change. And it's unlikely you're even going to get that in a day-long training, for example. So behavior change is seldom an event-based thing. Behavior change is a process that requires time and activities over that time in order for it to start getting embedded and become sustainable and even habitual over time. So, but even if you've got a really simple instruction to change behavior, like use the yellow broom, not the red broom, even that needs a bit of practice, especially if using the red broom was habit. People will reach for the red broom out of habit when they're distracted. So it's about doing it often enough that they no longer fall back on that old habitual behavior. So in effect, almost all new desired behaviors you're going to be creating will be replacing or upgrading an existing behavior, which in most cases is already habitual. So you are actually replacing an existing habit with a new habit. So that's never going to be an event-based phenomenon like a training course or something. It's always going to be a phenomenon that happens over time. So it takes time and repetition to embed a new habit with the required automaticity that it will then just function onwards and just becomes the way we do things around here because it's the habit.
Yeah.
So as soon as you talk about wanting to create that habitual new behavior, so that it's just how we do things, it becomes part of the culture, you really need to set up some kind of workflow of activities spread over time for people to both learn that what they need to learn in order, and then to apply that learning in such a way that they develop embedded skills that will build up into that new behavior you want. So there's a process involved there. I call that process a learning workflow. And this is very different to learning in the workflow, by the way. I wrote a blog on that if people want to go find it. So a learning workflow is a sequence of activities that you design that will take someone from behaviorally their current place to behaviorally where you want them to be in the future. In other words, what's the gap in terms of behavior? Where are they now? Where do you want them to be? So you've got an origin and a destination, and you need to design a sequence of activities for those people to do over a period of time in order for them to get there. And then ideally, of course, you have to hold them accountable for doing that sequence of activities, or they're not going to make the journey and get to their destination. If you design a fit for purpose sequence of activities and they follow them, then you're pretty much guaranteed to get them there to that behavioral destination, unless there's something within them maybe that means they can't manage it for whatever reason, in which case they're probably in the wrong job. So the other thing that happens, if you end up with that, I'll come back to your first question you had about technology here. I can close that loop. If you have a learning workflow that might run over, let's just say 2 months, for example, to develop feedback skills, or maybe something more complex than that, there's a whole sequence of activities spread over that time which will help them get from where they are to being adequately good at a threshold level with those feedback skills. Maybe even better, but certainly you want them at the threshold success point. And you've defined the endpoint and the way that we talked about earlier. Now, if those activities, you've got maybe 1 or 2 a week spread over 8 weeks, you've got 20 out activities maybe for each learner, you've got 100 learners, you're talking about thousands of activities to track and hold people accountable for. You need technology. So this is where you can start going from those fundamentals of looking for clarity on your endpoint and then working backwards from there through designing some kind of learning workflow to change that behavior, and then putting it out there and delivering that behavior, if you want to talk about it that way, using technology. So rather than think, I need to deliver content, think about, how do I deliver this behavior that we want, or the set of skills that will build up to that behavior. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, and that's where technology can come in. And so really you're talking about, I use the term learning workflow platform, another acronym, an LWP. Wow.
Yeah,
So it is designing and building that sequence of actions to take that people will need to go through to effectively and efficiently move from where they are to where you want them to be behaviorally.
And that means we're using technology with intention as well, I guess.
And I was talking with someone this morning in a biomedical lab and about workflows, and they said, we use those all the time in their lab. If a sample comes in, it goes through a workflow of tasks and activities. In other words, that sample gets taken from this machine to that, then it goes in the centrifuge, then it goes here into the class 2, security cabinet, then it goes, and so on. So it goes through a workflow. So workflows are common to all of us all of the time. Heck, when we go to the supermarket, which I'm doing straight after this webinar, we go through a workflow of things that we do to achieve the goal we're doing. All I'm talking about here is a workflow that will achieve a behavioral outcome. And I term it a learning workflow because that sounds cuter than learning behavioral workflow or something. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite so well. If you want to change behavior, you are going to have to develop a learning workflow to do that. And what you'll find is if someone just goes to a training course and changes their behavior on their own, they will have created their own learning workflow in effect to enable them to do that. Behavior won't change without that sequence of actions of practice, experimentation, and so on and so forth. So absolutely, you've got to be, generating these learning workflows. And then you can use technology, a learning workflow platform to get it out there and deliver all of those activities in that workflow.
Yeah, what I like about that is that it does bridge that gap in terms of we're using the technology with intention. Like, we know the behavior we want to get to, we know the problem we want to solve, and then we go and find the right tech, rather than, like we said at the start, rushing into using a piece of tech and not having clarity on where and how it should be used.
You're not running around thinking, we've got this wonderful bit of tech, we bought it, it's shiny, it's wonderful, but now what can we do with it? Where's the problem I can go and solve with it? It's it's a bit backwards, some of that stuff sometimes. Novelty
only gets you so far. The shiny new thing is only shiny to some people, and it's only interesting for as long as it's a novelty, and then as soon as it's not useful, it's perfect. There was one thing I wanted to ask you, Paul. I know you want to get to the weekly shop, so I won't take up too much more of your time. But it was this idea about, we spoke about stakeholders earlier and we've covered it a bit, but there's another blog post, and I'll add that to the description as well, where you have this framing around thinking in terms of who does it affect and how will it affect them. And I really like this as we start to understand who our audience are, who the stakeholders we need to involve are. So just love to hear a bit more on that framing of who does it affect and how will it affect them.
Well, that's the nub of it, really, is if somebody asks, I mean, typically a learning initiative will start because a manager somewhere says, I want some training, for this group of people, this department, whatever it is. And you've got to say, well, who else is involved? Clearly the learners or the delegates, the people there who are going to be trained are stakeholders, and they need to be involved because the change is going to affect them. And it's said that people don't like change. I disagree with that. We do things that change us all the time. We buy houses, we get married, we have kids, we do all sorts of stuff that changes our lives dramatically. But we do it because we decide to do it, not because someone imposes that change on us. So all of the different stakeholders that will experience some change as a result of this initiative need to be brought in some way, or at least representatives of those groups need to be brought in to talk about what will work for them. And of course, then you're using your crowdsourcing ideas. You might find there's all sorts of things they can help with in terms of the design and so on. So that's really, so which are the stakeholders who will experience some change as a result of this initiative? And then there's probably some other stakeholders who are separate, who may not experience an immediate direct change, but will experience downstream changes for one reason or another. So they need to be at least aware of what's happening and the downstream stuff that they might experience. So part of it is identifying those stakeholders and then going and have discussions with them. And it's in the same way as, it's not that they've got a problem necessarily, although clearly somebody has, otherwise you wouldn't even be having the discussion. But some of the other stakeholders, you can say, well, you're not experiencing an immediate problem right now, but over here there is one, and we're looking at doing this. Now, this is going to have some impact sideways on you. How do you feel about that? And again, it's stepping into their shoes as much as you can. So a lot of the same skills apply with talking to all of the stakeholders. And then, of course, you can chunk it up to the community, the town, the country, the planet, and so on, if you want to start looking at the much bigger, wider picture, which is always worth doing. But of course, it depends on your company and how big an impact you might have globally, et cetera, as to what sort of program you're working on.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's very empathetic framing, coming back to our point of listening and empathy, like just framing it in that sense of who is it going to affect and how will it affect them, adds a very human and compassionate element to the problem discovery process, I think.
Something that's worth doing is sort of brainstorming who are the stakeholders with, just on your own or, with a couple of colleagues, and you just start in the middle with the target audience, who have then put lines out on a bit of paper to all the other stakeholders, and then you can start getting fancy and start putting numbers or colors on them as to how much they're going to be affected, and then also things like whether they are likely to be friendly or unfriendly to the change that's being proposed, and how you're going to have to market it to them and sell it to them in order to get their buy-in, because you want buy-in from all your stakeholders, not just one or two. And you want proper buy-in, not compliance buy-in because the CEO says something. So again, that's about being in their shoes and understanding how this will impact and affect them from their perspective. You've always got to think about things from their perspective.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because something we often overlook is that there are different variables that affect resistance to change. So, for example, how long has someone been using X tool in their team, or how new is everybody in the team? Like, these are factors that might influence receptiveness to change. And I personally, I think I'm guilty of overlooking that as well. What are the variables and what are the levels, and how much pitching or how much of a problem solving communication piece is needed for that person to see the benefit and buy in. So I love that tip. Very interesting. Perfect. Paul, we're pretty much straight to time. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you again for joining me. It flew by. And like I said, there's lots of great links I'm going to put in the chat. Your website, where people can find out more about you, and also your books. And then I'll put a link to the very first article I mentioned, and where people can find your newsletter as well, and just keep getting some of this great content.
Thank you. And if anybody's got any questions about any of this stuff, just find me on LinkedIn and connect up. And I'm very happy to, to talk more about it to them, or talk about any general L&D strategy or other things they've got, or even, talk about learning workflows and how they might help, so absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah, really appreciate that, Paul. I'll put your LinkedIn profile in the description in that case as well.
Cool. Thank you very much.